Welcome. It's nice to see many familiar faces, and welcome to what support do leaders in education need to be effective and feel valued. This is the second in our series of conversation we are running in 2022. We are going to be running conversations every other month, and we will obviously post them on our social media to let everybody know what the topic is going to be about. We had an extremely successful webinar last month on the subject of the Great Resignation with over 40 attendees. So a really warm welcome to our panel speakers and our audience today. So thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to join us. We have about 55 minutes together, so this is not a webinar that's going to last for several hours. You'll be pleased to know. A few housekeeping points. As I said, the session is recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. And we'll be shared with some of the people who have registered for the webinar this afternoon who are not able to join us. I am going to be asking our panel members some questions, but also we would love to hear from anybody's views. So do feel free to use the chat windows, in particular on the right-hand side, and we will be asking questions. This is very much about. This is really the opportunity for everyone to participate, especially since we're going to be, looks like a fairly small group. And there will be some additional question towards the end of the discussion, at which point, if I open the floor to everybody, just use the little raise hand icon, which I'm sure everybody knows about. So I'd like to do some introductions. First of all, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. So we've got Angie Novell, who is the CEO of MK Snap, and Angie has worked a long time in education as well. And I can't remember when you became CEO, actually, Angie, of MK Snap. How long ago was that now?
I've been at MK Snap for 4 years, and prior to that, I was Director of Education at MK Don Sport and Education Trust for a decade and a bit.
Thank you. Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. We've also got Sally Hamson. Sally works as a school improvement partner in Milton Keynes, who is joining us on a panel today. We're also joined by Toni Hudson. So Toni is an employment lawyer working with education and at Freeths. And also helping to, so actually tell us a little bit more, Toni. You help to put schools together, is that what you do?
Thanks for the introduction, Freddie. So yeah, we have a lot of different educational clients on our books, so academies, trusts, private schools. I tend to get involved when things go wrong and need fixing, predominantly, unfortunately, and I'll speak to you a little bit more about that in a mo. But also, yeah, help put together, new appointments and senior posts. So it's not all doom and gloom, but mainly doom and gloom.
Thanks, Toni. So we're looking forward to that. Welcoming back Deborah Mattock. So Deborah is the Executive Director of Human Resources at the University of Northampton. We've had a long-lasting partnership with the University of Northampton, and we're delighted to welcome Deborah to join us on the panel today. And Deborah also joined us on the Great Resignation panel. So thank you for being there, Deborah. And we're also welcoming one of our new team member, Marie-Claire Parsons. So Marie-Claire joined us about 3 months ago and is heading up our fellowship programs. But Marie-Claire, in fact, commissioned the Red Thread Partnership about 2 years ago to help us when she became executive head of a village school federation. And she's now moved on to the other side, so she'll have a lot to say about leadership development in particular, as long as it's not too bad on what we did with you, Marie-Claire, but let's not get into this. And we were, as I said, we were really looking forward to welcoming also Sarah Findlay-Cobb, who was the CEO of Landau Forte Trust, but unfortunately She can't be with us as Ofsted called, and she started up in a meeting. So we'll be looking at the website in the next 3 weeks to see how she got on today and the results of Ofsted. So there we are. So just a little bit of background and why in particular the topic of support. What do support leaders in education need to be effective and feel value? I've long been fascinated by education. For those of you who know me, you'll know that my wife has been a teacher for almost 40 years, and I have seen firsthand the increasing pressure she's been under. Corporate businesses have access to a variety of support to help shape cultures, develop highly successful teams, and develop leaders. And it made me wonder what support there is for educationalists out there, and how valued they feel, and what is available to make educational leaders feel effective. You know, we have started to work with more schools, and in fact, I'm very pleased to welcome Jez, who's one of our new clients, on the call today. Now, interestingly, in setting up this discussion, we had a lot of interest, but found it a challenge to secure educational leaders to commit the time to attend. So that may be just an example of the time pressures which is being experienced everywhere at the moment. I'm delighted to have our panelists today to share their views on what it feels like to be a leader in education, and some of you are also involved with educationalists and leaders in educations. I mean, the example of Ofsted calling a short notice this morning is just one of the examples that you know, leaders in education have to deal with, and the pressures that exist in there. So I'm actually going to go straight in with a question, and I'll address it to Marie-Claire. I mean, Marie-Claire, when you know, so you've joined the dark side or the light side, as I say. You know, you've left education recently. What has been the biggest challenge in your leadership role, and what support was it for you?
Right, I'm going to say, can you hear me?
Can we hear you?
Because if you can all hear me,
no, you're on mute.
No,
yeah.
You don't need to mute.
Okay.
I think you can hear me without you muting. So that's right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've joined the dark side, or I've joined the light side. I think I've joined the light side. Having 5 schools was quite a challenge. Remind me the question again, Freddie, because I was thinking about if you could hear me or not.
What has been the biggest challenge in your leadership role, and what support was there for you when you became executive head?
So I think that the biggest challenge is time and lack of time. And lots of people say, well, you've got 3 months off the year, which is true. But the day-to-day running of schools, or 5 schools, the biggest challenge to me was firefighting. There was so much firefighting that it was hard to focus on strategic leadership. And just talking about Ofsted, I had the threat of 5 Ofsteds calling at any time, and that's a real challenge. And one of the other challenges that I experienced is that there's so much information in education coming at you. You've got information come from the DfE, you've got changes in regime, you've got changes in politics, you've got, sorry Sally, but school improvement partners telling you what to do. You've got Milton Keynes Council telling you what to do. And as a leader, it's really, really hard to focus on that strategy piece. So that's what I would say for me, was having so much information coming in, but it was all education based, which is why I went out and I approached Red Threads in the first place to get some external support and some information from the corporate side, if you like. Yeah, support, in terms of support, there is support, there's training, there's lots of training, but there's less development. I'm now involved in developing or facilitating on the Department for Education the new NPQ suites and the new training that the DfE has brought out, which is very, very good in one sense, but there's not an awful lot of what is leadership and how to be a leader. It's how to do education. So that was my experience.
Okay, thank you. And I guess in a different way, but the same question, I'd like to ask Deborah the same question really. What has been, you know, and suddenly what is the biggest challenge in your leadership role and what support is there for you and your team, Deborah?
Hi, yeah, I mean, I think my experience is very different being in a university. We don't have Ofsted, hurrah! Well, we do, but only in sort of parts. So our education provision. So that's something that that we don't have. I'm a governor at a local school, and I know when Ofsted call, everyone goes into mode, which is a shame, really. When anyway, that's a different story. But biggest challenge for me in leadership role. I think the biggest challenge and Marie Claire mentioned this. It's resources. There is always something new to do. There is always something else to do. There is always nobody ever says stop doing this. It's always the innovative, the new, the creative, the different. Try this, do this. Resources, of course, stay the same or get cut. So I think for me, there are so many things I'd want to do. But resources and time are the biggest challenges. And what support was there for you? A director of finance that would cut your budget if you went for a request. No. That is actually quite an interesting one, because now forgive me to the Red Thread team. I know I've not been very forthcoming in preparation for this. I had no idea what questions, because I'm literally sort of charging around a bit, having had a wonderful week off last week. But as I was going through the questions, what and sort of taking time to sort of reflect, I think what certainly has been my experience is the higher up the ladder you get, the less support there seems to be. I guess because there's an expectation that you'll become you're becoming the boss, and the boss doesn't need support. So what I've tried to do, in sort of recognizing that, what I've tried to do within our organisation is to create a coaching culture. So that those senior staff that do rise up and do actually find themselves potentially in quite lonely positions. I think, again, that's the other thing which may come about. The higher up the ladder you get, the lonelier sometimes it feels, is to make sure that we have got a coaching network. Now, I trained as a coach, and I've got colleagues who also trained as coaches. So we kind of, in that respect, we support each other. But in fact, only today, we've just recruited a new Chief Information Officer for the university, had a meeting with him, talking about what his needs are. And he said, can I have a coach? So I think coaching is something that I am a strong advocate and a strong supporter of. And if only I'd had one when I first started. So that kind of sums up, I think, my answer to that question, Freddie.
Yeah, no, I think, and personally, I think this is a fair point, because I think one of the other reasons for us to set this conversation together is often on LinkedIn. There are so many comments about leaders. This is your responsibility. Leaders, you must do this. Leaders, this and that. And I remember having a conversation with the team here. We're saying, well, actually, hang on a second. Leaders are human, and the higher you get, the more there is an expectation that actually you should be superhumans, who has all the answers to everything. And as a result of that, it becomes quite a lonely place. So I do love this coaching culture. I think that's a great way to handle it. Sally, can I come to you for a minute? So your job is, as in school improvement partner. You must have come across lots of different types of leaders. What's your experience of the leaders you've come across and some of the real challenges they're facing, and especially in building teams around them, teams who are capable and can deal with some of their challenges and issues?
Yeah, of course. just want to reassure, is it Marie Claire, that I was a head teacher before I was a SIP, so I share your pain. I've been there. And I also worked as a director of school improvement for a trust in Northamptonshire for 4 years. So yeah, I have worked and developed leaders. We took on 11 schools there, so working with those leaders, and then the work I've been doing across Milton Keynes. The work I've been doing in Milton Keynes, to tell the honest truth, has been picking up and doing what I'm being asked to do by Milton Keynes. So it's a very different role. Building, for me, it was going in and building trust with the leadership teams because they didn't know me. And there's always that fear of the unknown when you come in. So it was building the trust with them. And then I think having worked for MK for a while, that the feeling I felt there was that they are very well supported by the LA, actually. And although the LA do come in and demand this and demand that, there is also a culture of support, which is definitely missing from other local authorities, particularly the one where I used to work in, sorry. So looking at how supporting head teachers building teams and supporting middle leaders building teams, I think it's getting the right people. It's the old adage, isn't it? It's get the right people on the bus, and making sure that they've got the right people in the right places who are ready to take on those leadership roles. And that's not easy, because actually sometimes you can end up with the wrong person on that bus. And then it's really awkward to not get rid, because you don't necessarily want to get rid, but you might want to move them to a different place, a different direction. So that was really hard. I was just thinking round about what you were saying about challenges. For me as a leader, the biggest challenge I found was the incessant decision making that you were having to do. And how politically aware you suddenly had to become, and quite aggressive as well, in fighting for, we're always fighting for our children and to making sure they got what they needed. And so there were things I found quite difficult and that I found as a challenge. And I've completely forgotten what you asked me to talk about because I got carried away with other things. Sorry about that.
It's quite all right. I think it was very much about the experience of some of the leaders you've come across and some of the challenges they're facing, and their ability to build, more importantly, their ability to be talent around them as well.
That's it. And I think there is a massive gap out there at the moment for new head teachers coming in. I know when I started years and years ago, there was a new visions program with the National College and we were quite well supported. I had a coach, I had a mentor, we had training, and it doesn't exist. And it does worry me that our head teachers are out there in their new roles within a year or 2 years of doing it. And there is very, very little support for them, which I think is an area that really needs addressing quite urgently, because building those teams is hard. Running a school is hard. When you pick the whole lot together and you're all newbie at it, it's a real double whammy. And these last 2 years, of course, have been pure hell on earth for everybody, haven't they, really?
Indeed. No, absolutely. I mean, you've got a good point. Angie, can I come to you, because I'm interested. You've also, so you spend a lot of time in education, and you've also you're heading up a charity. What has your journey been like into senior roles, and what did you gain by becoming a senior leader or transferring from education to where you are now? Because I suppose you're still involved in education in some way.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for me, I was reflecting on this earlier when I was thinking about the questions, and the one thing I knew when I was studying in my late 20s was I absolutely did not want to teach. And having come to that conclusion, I then found myself thinking, oh, actually, this might work quite well, because I might get a term time contract and I've got 2 small children, and actually I can make this work in my life. And I can honestly say I've never had a term time contract in my entire teaching career. And of course, I went at it slightly differently, in as much as I ended up teaching adults and community learning. But my goodness me, I'm so pleased that I went on that journey, because that for me has really shaped the whole of the last couple of decades, really, of my career working with adults. And I think on my reflection earlier on the questions, one of the things I honestly believe now is I'm probably, I think, a more effective leader than I was a teacher. And yet my motivation, even to this day, is of being around the learning. So the thing that motivates me as a senior leader in a charity setting is being able to leave my office and go and walk around and feel the learning happening and see the learning happening. And that's all the motivation I could ever need to have to do what I need to do. Of course, you lose something when you get behind a desk, because your role does change and it does become much more email-led and those kind of things. But I think it is the immediacy of being in a teaching setting and being in a setting like we all are that actually provides the joy. And for me, if I didn't have that, I think it would be a very different experience that I'm having. Just reflecting on what the other speakers have been talking about, I think one of the challenges for me was really adapting to the speed of change, because you come into a new role. I came in as a sort of, super enthusiastic first role as chief executive 4 years ago, and I wanted to change everything immediately. And, there is that realization in any leadership role that actually it's a listening exercise. So I've had to do a lot more listening than perhaps blue sky thinking. And there is that relentless challenge of selling the vision to everybody, whether that's commissioners, funders, parents and the students, but also bringing the team with me as well. So I totally embrace what's already been said about a coaching approach. I think, being able to give people time and space to buy into the bigger picture, buy into the vision. But also, I think critically for me, it's the work that I've done with the team around values. So we're a values-led organisation, and making the decisions that we do based on, does this fit our values? And I think that's a real privilege that we have in the voluntary sector, to be able to make decisions that are about people first and foremost, rather than having to look at spreadsheets, albeit that there is an element of that in the bottom line. I think that's a real privilege for me in my setting as a leader.
So, I think that's great, and and to be able to reflect the two. But I guess one of the questions I'd have is, so knowing what you know now, when you're in education and you were moving through the ranks and you're thinking about the development of yourselves and your teams, what would you have done differently?
I think for me, it's possibly it's a case of not always having the answer. And actually, it reflects a little bit of what Sally was saying about the relentless decision making. I think being able to say at an early stage, as an authentic leader, I don't know the answer to that question. And in a coaching approach, to throw it out there and say, let's see if we can come up with a solution as a team. And it takes a massive amount of personal pressure off what would be off me individually, but I also think it's the way to develop your team and manage your own mental health and emotion and energy. And I wish I'd done that probably earlier in my career, rather than always trying to be the one that came up with the answers.
Yeah, and I guess that's confidence as well, isn't it? As you move forward. What I like to do, I'm going to ask Graham to put a little poll for us at this stage. So, Graham, if you don't mind, if you mind voting on those, if that's okay. So what's the key enablers to develop management talent in education, or leadership capability in education? Make it a priority, reward appropriately, make it an Ofsted requirement, don't bother, we don't have time. That's straightforward. So let us know, Graham, when everybody's voted, please, and then we can see what people have said on the poll. It should be an interesting response. I wonder if don't bother, we don't have time is going to be based on what people have said. Are we getting the result? Okay. Here we are. Make it a priority. Of course, I'm not going to do some witch hunt to say who voted don't bother, we don't have time, but So make it a priority. That's an interesting one. Thank you very much for the response there. How do we, and I'm going to open this, you know, to any of my panels. How do you make it a priority? How can you make it a priority when there is so much going on and there is this relentless drive? Who'd like to have a go at this? Sally.
Yeah, it's been I'll go into my head teacher role here as because and my trust role, because it's hard to do this as a school improvement partner. But as a head teacher, it was a massive drive for me, was to develop the staff, to make them. For me, it was a fundamental belief, I'll rephrase it, that we are in the education game, and that's education for everybody, not just the children, but all the adults who are involved in it, who choose to come into that. And we're in it for all of those. And it became a really important driver for me, was to develop A, teachers, and B, leaders. I became a lead school for the Schools Direct programme for that one and only reason, that I wanted to recruit good teachers. And so I was able to have the trainee teachers in, working with the University of Northampton, to get them in. And then as they trained and spent the hours they spent in my school learning how I wanted them to be, I was then able to employ them. And actually, I would say 80% of my staff came through that route. I then firmly believe in developing your teaching assistants, developing your volunteer parents, if that's what they want to do. And I think having a culture of professional development running right through everything that you do, and it being a passion and a vision of what you're up to, I think that will enable people to move on and progress. I mean, I was very lucky. I have 4 deputies through my school who are now all successful head teachers, which is something I'm incredibly proud about. But that all came down to that culture of belief and that culture. And if you want to do it, I will support you in doing it as much as I possibly can.
Okay, that's a very good point. Very good answer. Does anyone want to add anything to that? On the panel, anybody? Okay, so Toni, I'm going to come to you now. And you referred a little bit earlier about some of the work. So you're an employment lawyer, and you do, you know, a lot of work, you know, with educationalists and so on. And I'm sure you cannot disclose any name or anything in confidence, but we are interested to see what sort of challenges you are coming across in the work that you are doing, and in particular with some of the either middle managers or leaders you're dealing with. Could you share some of that with us?
Yeah, of course. I mentioned doom and gloom. So where I get involved is to do a bit of the fixing, and when things have gone a little bit wrong. And as a bit of an outsider, obviously advising clients on these issues, I think even I can see some of the common themes that are being discussed. So Deborah mentioned about not having the right resources or sufficient resources or tools. I can give you an example. I worked with a school very recently. It's a private school setting where the head teacher was looking to have these team meetings sort of after school time. The difficulty that she faced is that not all of the employees were on sort of the same contracts. So some employees were leaving sort of at midday because that's how they were contracted. Full-time employees seemed quite happy to stay after hours, and others weren't even working on the day that these meetings were taking place, which was obviously a huge challenge for her to try and drive change because staff weren't on board. So I think as a starting point, well, look, we needed to get the contracts in place. We needed to get that buy-in from staff and make sure they were there to discuss important issues, which is where I came in. So I fixed the contracts, but also we needed to go through a consultation process. And as part of that consultation process, it then became clear that actually she had limited training on how to consult and how to sit down and talk to people about legal issues, which is I'm happy to do. And when I advise clients, I like to do it in such a way that the next time they may not have to spend as much money with me. They will feel confident in doing that themselves. But I think the key takeaways from that was, well, look, she didn't have the basic tools she needed from a legal point of view to hold these meetings, and then hadn't been given sort of any training on how to consult. And I think it's quite common that the client would have a procedure laid out. here's a disciplinary process, here's a grievance process, here's a redundancy process. But actually, what does it mean to sit down and discuss those issues? What do I do? What do I say? And I think a common misconception from my clients is that you have to say a lot of things in those meetings when you don't. With the consultation process, you are taking in and listening, noting and really considering. And I think, forgive me if I've got that wrong, I think Angela said about not always having all the answers and not being afraid to sort of say that, which is sort of my key learning point with consultation process. So to come back to the question, Freddie, I think is I'm seeing clients not having the right resources, training and legal documents to get things done.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean that just tally with some of the conversation we've been having with some people. I think obviously in a different way, having in particular the confidence to get involved. Let's go back to you, Marie-Claire, on these questions of confidence and so on. So when you think about some of the opportunities you had, some of the enablers or disablers, what made it possible for you to become an effective leader in your role, as you were going into your exec leadership, but also maybe throughout your career, because you were deputy head for a while and then you moved into exec head. So what did you go on to learn the job, I guess?
For me, it was very much about collaboration with other practitioners. So I always reached out and spoke to other deputy heads. When I took on my headship, I was in a very small school, and as Deborah said, it's a very lonely role. So that's why I reached out to other small schools, to village schools, to see how we could collaborate, share, talk, share expertise, because everyone's got different skills, different expertise. And that's where the federation came about. And then I was on my own with 6 schools. So enablers, for me, it's collaboration. And it's really interesting hearing what you said, Toni, because I had to go through several consultations to join schools, consultations to close schools, which was very painful. No support for that, or very little support for that. Consultations for redundancies, all sorts. And it's interesting hearing you say that actually we have to do those sorts of roles as leaders in education, but really without the skills to do that, which is great that there's people like you supporting us for that. So enablers for me is collaboration. Disablers is time and having to wear so many hats. And I think Angela was right in saying one of the key skills is to know that you don't know everything. Because I remember on my very first day as a leader in education, having that awful imposter syndrome of sitting at the desk thinking, no idea what I'm doing. And you don't learn about the role of leadership in education until you're in that role, by which point sometimes it's too late.
Indeed. No, thank you for that. We've got a question here from Jane. Do you think the support for leaders is different or the same across primary, secondary, further education and higher education? I'm interested to hear from the panel on their views on that. Does anybody has a particular opinion? I mean, Deborah, can I come back to you in particular? So you talked about coaching culture, but what are some of maybe some of the more practical things that your team have access to, and is it easily accessible? What's there basically?
Yeah, and interesting. I guess we can only really answer that question if we worked across the sectors. But interestingly, I've been a governor at a primary school and at secondary school, and obviously I work now in higher education, and certainly from the school that I work with, they actually provide very similar, maybe it's because I'm on the board, but they actually provide very similar staff development to what we provide our staff in terms of leadership. And I guess one of the reasons I'm on the board is because I take my experiences in, so that may be the reason why. But certainly for our upcoming leaders and our leaders, we have a very comprehensive leadership development program which we've developed internally. We also use externals, and we have had a cohort that have gone through the red thread. Annoyingly, everyone who did that has now left and gone on to better things. Thank you, Freddie.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, thank you.
It worked then. Sorry.
Yeah. We only run our leadership development program every other year, because it gets to the point where you have to manage expectations, because some people do it because they want to be leaders, but we also have to balance that with an incredibly flat structure. So you have all of these people trained as leaders but not having an opportunity to be a leader. And then what we have done, which we have found, and again this has been copied in the secondary school that I'm at, we have leadership circles. So if you're part of a cohort, whether it was 5 years ago, 2 years ago, we have these leadership circles, and they continue to meet, and they sometimes cross meet, so we bring them all back as well. They've kind of kept that network going. I think certainly the leadership circles have been as successful as the actual formal development programs, and that's all been very positive.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Deborah. Anyone else who'd like to comment on that in particular? So is the is the support different across different groups?
I was just going to add, obviously we have all different types of clients, and personally I see common themes across the board. So I don't know if that's sort of telling. I mentioned some of the issues that I see is, yes, our senior leaders know that there is a process and there is a policy in play, but actually, how do we run those meetings? What do I say? I get those questions across the board, doesn't matter what sort of setting. And it seems to me that there's limited internal resource to support that. Just my personal view, what I'm seeing on the ground.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, that leads me to an overall question, which is cost or time the main barriers to develop leaders in education, and actually what can be done about it? So where does the money come from? Because whenever we we have conversations with schools and whatever, it is always about the budget, it is always about the time, when do we find the time, and so on. So does anybody have a view on that, in terms of cost? Is it cost, is it time, is it both? What does it say? I mean, Sally, you've worked across, as I said, many different organizations. What's the sense of that? Because there's always money available if we want to make it available.
Yeah, but I think it goes further back than that. As I said, when I first stepped into headship, I was lucky enough to be part of the National College and take on the new visions, and that's disappeared because the funding was pulled for that, so that never happened. We then had all sorts of, I can't remember the name, but we had all sorts of other projects leaping up that were then disbanded by the DFE. So it does come down to cost, and without getting on any political bandwagons, finances are in a dire state in schools at the moment. And I think as a head teacher, or even as a leader of any kind, I think prioritising money for your own development at the detriment of giving it to the children is something that you really, really balk at doing. Because we should, of course, put it for our own development. Of course we should. But actually, when you're juggling whether you're going to spend £2,000 on you, or whether you're going to spend £2,000 on getting little Billy there some extra support that he needs to help him improve at his reading, you know where that money's going to go. It's not going to go on you. So yes, I think finances is a biggie actually with this. Time, I don't know. I guess we can always find the time if we have to. I mean, if you're a leader, you've got a good senior team around you, you should be able to find the time. I honestly think it comes down to finances. We are very underfinanced, and all these new initiatives seem to pop up and then get pulled away again. And I do think it comes to that, really.
Anyone else with a view? Angie, anything you'd like to add on that? Or any of our guests who are there as well, please free to comment.
I was just going to say that from a charity point of view, where we're trying to employ professional people, so people with a teaching background and qualification without a professional pay scale, it becomes quite a challenge. But in actual fact, what we've tended to do is, where we don't pay anything like a similar rate to the kind of rate you'd expect for a teacher to earn in the school, we really do promote the benefits of working in a sort of, you know, fairly holistic and therapeutic setting. So in the voluntary sector, I guess we're trying to promote ourselves to professional people on a different basis. So we have a lot more freedom with the curriculum and those kind of things. And increasingly, where we see people from traditional teaching backgrounds really struggling with mental health, and we know that that is a big challenge, that is sometimes a driver towards coming to work in the voluntary sector, where the pay is lower, but possibly there is a different set of pressures. And that's not to say that that's an easy thing to do. And I think our responsibility then is to continue to develop people and to continue to support them. But it was just as an aside, really, to looking at how we develop people and kind of accept that it's a springboard onto other things as well. So we developed quite a few teaching staff, given them their first opportunity to maybe even experience teaching in an adult setting. And then we like to see them progress, because for us, that's a success story as well.
Yeah. So is there, because I'm actually, as I'm thinking about the question for this conversation, what supports do leaders in education need to be effective and feel valued? And then maybe I should have added, and stay, because, you know, I'm sorry, Deborah, but you know, on the program now, everybody's left. But the point is actually, this is good, but not as well, not good in some ways. So how do we ensure, you know, what do we need to do to create an environment where people are coming, understanding the challenge, but are able to cope with the challenges? Should we be looking at the problem in a different way? Any thoughts or views on that? Are we tackling the issue in a more traditional way? Are we looking at, you know, development in a way it's always been done? Is culture the answer? Is culture the answer to ensuring that people want to be part of the, you know, whichever establishment they're in? Any thoughts on that? I can see everybody's thinking hats on, but
I was just thinking about your question and trying to unpick it. I think there's quite a lot in what you've asked, but I'm just going to touch on, Jez has put something in the chat window, yeah, which might connect with what you're saying. So he's just put career progression within most education sectors involves taking on more responsibilities as a teacher. And you're right, you know, sometimes you have TAs who go on to do the teacher training, become a teacher, and as soon as you're a good teacher and there's a chink of light that you're going to be a leader, then you're given more responsibility, sometimes without the support that underpins that. And he's gone on to say, you know, how can we better help our teachers consider themselves as leaders more quickly, and how can we bring in coaching much earlier on? And I think that answers the questions you've asked, that it is culture. And you know, we're talking about this coaching culture, peer culture, and actually it's somebody on this call today in the audience who said to me, came into my school and said to me, tell me how you teach a class. So I went through all the things that I do using all the skills, and she said, those are leadership skills. And I said, no, those are teaching skills. She said, those are leadership skills. And when I stepped out of my head and I thought, yes, actually, right from the bottom up, we have got leaders in our school, and even the children's are leaders. And if you've got the leader at the top creating a culture where all those people can develop the leadership skills, then we are approaching it from a different way. I don't know if that's quite answered your question, but it made me think of those things when you were talking about it.
I mean, thank you. I think that's helpful. I actually do think there's maybe an opportunity to look at the problem in a different way, which is never easy when you know, when looking at how to do things in a different way. Culture has to be key. I mean, you know, Claire, I think culture is a key element in any organization, at 100%. should we start the process earlier on? I mean, one of the things we were debating a couple of days ago when we were thinking about the webinar in particular is to say, when it comes to teaching practices, when we take younger people who are going to come into the sector, should more be done at that level to actually prepare people to come into, because education has changed so much. There are so many more pressures. Does anybody have a thoughts on that?
I think a lot of it comes down to what is a leader. And I think there is a danger of thinking that a school has senior leaders. But actually, you're right. Leadership goes through pretty much everything that we do. Obviously, I'm talking from a university perspective rather than a school perspective. At my son's school, he learns from the age of 13, 14, whatever. He's on the Young Leaders program. So schools themselves are developing young leaders, but are we recognising that actually we within an institution we potentially are all leaders? So I think that's and we actually deliberately use the word leader, not just at senior level, not even at, well, it's funny, isn't it? You're middle management, but you're a senior leader. Actually, maybe you're a middle leader. I know the school that I'm with have recently changed their vocabulary to they actually talk about middle leaders, not middle managers. I think if you start using the language of leadership within an organisation, that also can have an impact about how people feel about the work that they do. That's just
I think that's a very good point. I think that's an extremely good point. In many organizations we work with, when transforming organization, we're looking at building high-performing teams. One of the things we explore is what language, what words are they using? And I think you may have a point there, Deborah, where 100% is the narrative and the language being used in schools, and I don't know anything enough about it. I'm putting it to the panel really. Is the language used in school currently fit for purpose? And actually, does it recognize the need to change? Does it recognize the challenges our educators are facing today? And is it allowing for the right mindset? Because everybody talks about, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but teachers being quite fixed in their mindsets, and education being a vocation. I mean, if I go back to my wife in particular, whenever promotion was presented to her, she just completely shut away from it. She said, no, I am very happy just to be a teacher. Don't give me any more. You can give me more responsibility, but whatever you do, don't call me a leader. So just a question, Marie-Claire, Sally, Tony, is there Angie, is there an opportunity to change the language perhaps a little bit earlier? Is that an opportunity?
I think the language is changing, isn't it? If we do talk about Ofsted, which I know we've managed to avoid really talking about most of the seniors, which is great, but they've changed their language, and the fact that it's not subject leaders, it's curriculum leaders they're talking around. I think when they go and do this deep dive nonsense that they do, it is encouraging our middle leaders to take a leadership role. And I know it's caused lots of hoo-ha and everything, and we'll not discuss that for this bit, but they are changing their way of being and their language, which encourages schools, because whatever Ofsted do, we tend to change with them and go along with them, whether we agree with it or not. And I think you're right. I think it is about that. But I also think head teachers and deputy heads need to take a bit of here in the fact that we need to not keep moaning to our staff about how tough the job is, so they actually want to do it. If we keep kind of looking doom and gloom and going out around our schools, woe is us, and why would you want to do this job and I hate it, our middle leaders aren't going to want to step up. And I think that may be something, that may be a culture change that needs to happen. And it's so hard to do when you're stuck in the mire of everything. But I do think maybe that's something that needs to change. How we change it, I don't know, but it could be something that we may need to think about.
Yeah, I think there's a point there. Does anyone else have a view on that?
It's interesting, Sally, what you said. You said earlier about your deputies had stepped into your role, and my deputy stepped into my role. And I was thinking when you were saying about that language and not moaning about the job, yeah, it's an interesting point actually, and that change. But I think you're right, we should be talking about everybody as a leader of education in schools. For everybody, we are all leaders of education because that's what we're there for.
Good point. I've noticed a note from Claire Palmer. I mean, Claire, you said that you've recently done some work with the school and language was an issue. Are you able to join us on this conversation? Are you able to perhaps explain a little bit more on what has happened without obviously giving any secrets?
Yeah, hi.
Hello, Claire. Hi.
Okay.
Yes, we can indeed.
Sorry, I couldn't come on camera earlier. I was in the car.
No problem at all.
Yeah, so I went into a school recently to help them reframe their relationships with each other, and very much the relationship between teachers and support staff, so the business support teams, finance, etc. And it was really interesting, just the simple dynamics of kind of the teaching staff having to go upstairs to the business area. It made some of them feel quite intimidated because the only times they went up there was to ask for something or whatever. And equally, the support staff felt like the teaching staff were just too demanding. They never appreciated the whole scope of what they had to do. So it was really interesting exercise to get them to go up and tell each other one thing that they really admired about the other person, and then one thing that they cared enough about that person to tell them so that they could actually improve on that. So at first, I think everyone in the room was a bit like, oh gosh, we can't go and say nasty things. But once they realized it was coming from a place where we actually want to enhance the relationship and enhance the school, people were far more open to it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you for sharing that, Claire. That's extremely useful.
And just to say, I really liked what Sally just said. And the one thing I did with that school was they all agreed to stop using the word busy. They weren't allowed to tell each other they were busy. They had to be far more descriptive about it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think there is definitely something here about language. I mean, you know, in a very different way, we did some work, you know, 3 years ago with a team who wanted to become a high-performing team, and they were constantly using the language of being second-class citizen within the organization. And of course, we become what we believe. So on the basis of that, you know, one of the commitment we made certainly to each other in that process is to stop talking about ourselves as second-class citizen, and in fact they're now award-winning and very much high-performing. So I'm conscious that we've got about 4 minutes left on our webinar. Are there any pressing questions from anyone before I you know, maybe wrap up and say thank you to everyone? Does any of our colleagues who are listening to the webinar, any particular questions from anybody? In fact, I've seen a question here that's just come in. Let's have a look. Is there a disconnect between teachers, leaders, and support staff? Is there a disconnect between teachers, leaders, and support staff? I mean, that's a good question. I think from what we've just heard Claire say, that there's a strong possibility that might be the case in some organization. But does anyone want to add anything to that? No, I think we've Deborah, I've noticed you moved your hand towards the mouse. So
I was actually just going to say that in higher education, there's a real, and I think it's about, I always got this thing about being defined by something that you're not. So we have the academics, and then we have the non-academics. And quite often it's like, well, we have our professional services team, which means that you academics must be non-professional. You know, and again, it does again come back to language, because obviously the academics are the most important people. Actually, they're not, because without the professional services, and I know in schools you use the word support, but I actually don't like the word support, because that again tends to suggest hierarchy. And quite often we've got frameworks, pay frameworks and job evaluation frameworks that span across professional services and academia, and they're on the same grade. Their job has been valued as being of equal value. So I'm not here to support except you. I'm here to provide a professional service, and you are here as an academic to do the teaching, the delivery. And again, that's actually been quite a slow process, because I know I started as an academic. And when I was asked to take up being director of HR, there was this real sort of crossing to the other side. Someone actually even said that I'm joining the dark side. Actually, no, I've become a director of a professional service within an educational establishment where I am still an academic. And that a lot of people couldn't get their heads around that. So I think, I'm conscious of time, I think what I'm hearing that is happening in schools happens in the HE and the FE sector as well, but it is about changing the language, about changing the culture, and about being more understanding about the important roles that we all play in providing the education to our learners.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, so I'm going to bring this conversation to a close, and firstly, I want to say a huge thank you to our panel today, because I think this conversation I feel can probably go on for some time. But the things I've taken out of the of this debate in particular is, so when we think about supports for leaders in education to be effective and feel valued, what we've heard is if you can build a coaching culture, that can actually help greatly, for people to feel supported within the context of the organization. But don't just do it ad hoc. Do create a culture where people understand what being a coach looks like and feels like, because it's easy to say I've become a coach, but to understand the true value of being a coach is something that has to be taught and can be learned certainly as a skill. We also talked about the importance of language. How can language help to break barriers down and maybe change the mindsets and also bring people together, which actually, if we can think of language in a different way, if we can reframe some of the words that we are using, and maybe that will help us drive the culture change that maybe education establishments will need to operate in a more modern world and help to move. And all this, the good news about this is you probably don't have to spend a lot of money to do it, because certainly language is a mindset, and it's a commitment that as leaders in education you could make reasonably quickly by engaging your teams and having a conversation about what kind of values, what kind of organization we want to be, what's going to be important to us, and making a commitment to that. I wonder what the role of trustees can be. What's the role of some of the stakeholders, because we've not touched on stakeholders in particular, and I do know they play a huge part in influencing the culture of schools and so on, and trustees as well. So that could be maybe for another conversations. And ultimately, I think there's something about bravery and having a go, because right now, what's the worst that can happen? So thanks everyone. I thoroughly enjoy the conversation. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you, Angie. Sally, thank you very much. Marie-Claire, thank you. Deborah, thank you. And Toni, thank you so much for joining our panel. Thank you to everyone who came to join us today. We are going to make this conversation available, as I said, on our YouTube channel and our social medias. If you want to carry on with any other questions, do contact us directly. And in the meantime, we'll let you know when our next conversation is going to be. And please have a good rest of the week. Thank you.